We'll bring in now John Sitilides. He's here with us as well, a former State Department diplomacy consultant, and Daniel Flesch, a former senior advisor to the United Nations mission. Gentlemen, thank you both. John, if I could start with you on this. So this leak, first of all, talk about that, what went through your mind. Does that change the relationship between Israel and the U.S.? Obviously, the U.S. Threatened an arms embargo at one point for Israel if they didn't get enough humanitarian aid into Gaza. Nevertheless, Israel continues on. Now you have this leak. Where is the relationship going between Israel and the U.S. in your mind?
Well, first, let's call this for what it is. It is a serious and grave breach of intelligence sharing and cooperation between the U.S. and Israel. And I would say, unfortunately, it reflects a pattern that goes back at least 10 to 12 years. There was a similar leak of Israeli plans to potentially attack Iran's nuclear facilities in 2012 under the Obama administration. And as you just mentioned, we had this leak just several weeks ago of private correspondence between Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin with the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant, threatening an arms embargo on Israel regarding the pace of humanitarian aid for Gaza. So we have a serious problem here, I think, both in terms of putting Israel on the diplomatic defensive. I would add one more thing. I think it's going to make it very difficult for Israel to trust the Biden administration with any type of serious intelligence considerations going forward, given that there are potentially a number of alleged Iranian spies inside this administration.
Daniel, perhaps you wanted to comment again on this leak as well. How would this change Israel's response to what we had seen from Iran against Israel several weeks ago?
So first off, Israel will have to respond to the October 1st, the second ballistic missile strike that Iran conducted against it. The quality of that strike might change slightly depending on what was leaked, what they expect the Iranians to expect in terms of an Israeli response, but it does not preclude the fact that they will respond. And I want to emphasize something that John mentioned, which is the bigger issue here certainly is on the American side of the Atlantic. It's not so much the degradation of relations between this administration and Israel, but it's also about Iranian efforts to influence our own government and assets inside our government feeling it's okay to leak sensitive information about our ally Israel, particularly during a time of war. But again, this is not going to preclude Israel from responding to the October 1st strike from Iran.
John, does this mean that Israel would have to, even though they insist on carrying out their attack on Iran at some point, a retaliatory measure, as they call it, does this mess with the timing of it all, the leak?
It's difficult to know because that's a decision that's being made solely by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his top military strategists and national security advisors. As Daniel just mentioned, this will take place. We don't know the scale, we don't know the scope, and we don't know the timing. I would predict, though, that there's going to be almost zero advance notification of the White House right before the strike is about to be launched, again, because there's a concern that any information that's conveyed from Jerusalem to Washington right now will find its way into the public domain.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's pivot now to the other presidential candidate in the race, of course, that being former President Donald Trump. He sat down with a Saudi state-owned international Arabic news channel the other day, and he had this to say about President Biden telling Israel not to hit Iran's nuclear or oil facilities. Here's that conversation.
Biden has been historically horrible on foreign policy, incompetent, I would say. What you do is anything he says, do the opposite, and you'll be brilliant if you do the opposite. But he gave him instructions not to do anything, and Israel was under great danger. They're under much less danger right now than they were 1 month ago. Let's face it.
Daniel, so could you maybe contrast what we see from Trump foreign policy approach to Israel versus what we currently see in the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, certainly. I mean, if you don't want to believe President Trump about Biden's foreign policy record, believe Obama's and President Bush's Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, who said that Biden had been wrong on every foreign policy decision for 40 years. So we're seeing the fruits of that essentially playing out across the Middle East over the past year plus. In contrast, under President Trump, you had the Abraham Accords come together, which is the greatest strategic shift in the Middle East since probably the 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And right now, you have the devolution of the Middle East into a failed region. You have a regional war against Israel, and unfortunately, the United States is not being as forthright with our ally as it is in trying to prevent it from responding to attack Iran. So you have a great contrast between 4 years of quiet under the Trump administration in the Middle East and now over a year plus of essentially, again, Israel fighting an existential war against its mortal enemy, Iran.
John, I wanted to bring this up. We kind of talked about it vaguely earlier. The Biden-Harris administration pushing for their own calls, ceasefires between Israel and Hamas. This has been going on and on. Obviously, Vice President Kamala Harris is the Democratic presidential nominee, and she has this idea. Here's VP Harris. Watch.
It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, but we have got to get this war over with. We got to get the hostages out. We need the war to end. In fact, we're sending Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, out next week to go and meet with the parties there.
So, John, the messaging hasn't changed here, but many critics say this is continued political posturing. She's worried about losing votes, specifically in Michigan. She doesn't have that Arab American PAC endorsing her at the time. So while she's calling for a ceasefire that's been called for many times over and over again, she's back there on the table calling for that, and then also ending the war happening in Gaza, specifically with Hamas. John, can you respond to that?
Yes, first of all, I'm not privy to the internal thinking on polling and strategy on the Kamala Harris campaign, but I would just say as a general rule, it's unwise to continue to push for a quote-unquote ceasefire when the war against Israel is not over, and it won't be over until Iran decides to end the war against Israel by funding, by financing, by training, by equipping all of these proxy groups, whether it's Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, these militia in Iraq and Syria. The problem is not the inability to achieve a ceasefire, it's Iran's determination to annihilate Israel. And until that issue is addressed, a ceasefire really doesn't help to achieve the wider stability that we seek in the Middle East.
Yeah, not to mention they've been using this talking point for months now. It's the same thing over and over again. John Sitilides and Daniel Flesch, thanks so much, gentlemen, for coming on this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.